Helen White, a 60-year-old white woman, has lived her entire life in the conservative and prejudiced atmosphere of her wealthy suburban family. From a young age, Helen was enveloped in rigid views that considered people of color to be inferior. Her view of the world, especially regarding race, was strongly influenced by the values and beliefs passed down from her family. Her grandfather was a large landowner, and her father, a successful businessman, shared racist ideas, constantly reminding her that white people were superior to people of color, especially black people. Helen grew up in this prejudiced environment and never questioned the validity of the views imposed by her family and the society around her. In her mind, people of color were untrustworthy, lazy, and incapable of achieving success, like white people. Helen took it for granted that she kept her distance from people of color. Throughout her youth, she had witnessed racism everywhere, from the unfair treatment of people of color in stores and restaurants to the marginalization of them in matters like employment and education. Helen did not mind this, however. On the contrary, she saw it as the natural order of things. In middle age, Helen married a man who shared her racial views. They lived a quiet life in a large house in the suburbs, where racial divisions were even more pronounced. Their neighbors were all wealthy white families, and their domestic servants, when they had any, were all people of color. Helen never questioned the injustices that people of color faced. Instead, she continued to nurture and pass on to her children the old-fashioned views that she believed to be true. In Helen's eyes, people of color, especially black people, could never achieve the same social status and success as white people. She often wondered why white people could tolerate the presence of people of color in positions of power, such as in politics or business. For Helen, it was unacceptable for a person of color to be respected or have social influence. She lived in contentment with her own views, never seeking change or wanting to gain a deeper understanding of human diversity. Helen also joined social clubs, where she made friends with like-minded people. They held meetings to discuss the golden age of America, when things were, in their opinion, more right. She often found comfort in hearing stories about white control of society and the exclusion of people of color. Helen White walked into the upscale mall one afternoon, feeling as comfortable and familiar as ever. For her, the place was a haven of luxury, a place where she could feel high class, surrounded by people she considered her own. However, that comfortable mood quickly disappeared when her eyes fell on the next stall, where David Carter, a black man in his mid-30s, was shopping for his family. David stood in front of the stall, focused on choosing beautiful items for his wife and 2 young children. With his casual demeanor and caring eyes, David clearly puts a lot of thought into making sure that everything he buys will suit his family's needs. But what Helen could not bear was not this ordinary act, but the presence of a black man in a space that she had always considered for white people. Helen's discomfort flooded her like an undercurrent. Her eyes shifted from surprise to contempt. She could not understand why a black man could appear here, especially in such a high-class store. To her, this was not just an inconvenience but an insult, breaking the invisible boundary that she had always believed existed between the races. In the heat of the moment, Helen shot David a contemptuous glance, unable to stop herself from muttering racist slurs under her breath. David heard Helen's insults, even though she tried to keep them low. He was used to this kind of prejudice. It was something he had faced all his life. But this time, the feeling of resentment still filled him. He was a doctor and had worked hard to overcome many racial barriers and social prejudices to get to where he was. But it seemed that for people like Helen, it was never enough. David kept quiet, trying to stay calm. He didn't want Helen's insults to affect him. He knew he couldn't control how other people thought or acted, but he could control how he reacted. What he had learned over the years was not to let anger control him. So David took a deep breath, continued picking out clothes for the family, and tried to ignore Helen's negative presence. However, the tension did not stop there. Helen, not willing to stop with just words, decided to show her contempt more clearly. She walked past David and deliberately bumped into him as she passed. It was not a light or unintentional collision, but a deliberate action. Helen immediately turned around, looking angry as if David was the one who had done something wrong. She shot him a malicious look, then loudly said, "Can't you see that you are blocking the way?" David stood still, shocked by Helen's aggression and unreasonableness. He knew that he had done nothing wrong, but this incident was clearly more than just an accidental collision. It was a manifestation of Helen's deep disrespect for him, simply because of the color of his skin. The atmosphere between them immediately became tense, as if everyone around could feel the hostility radiating from Helen. Even so, David remained calm. He knew that reacting with anger would only make the situation worse. Instead of confronting Helen, he chose to stay silent and take a step back, creating distance between them. He wasn't being cowardly or evasive. He simply didn't want to get involved in a pointless argument. With all his experience, David knew that silence was sometimes the strongest answer. Helen, seeing that David did not respond, became even more frustrated. In her mind, the fact that someone like David did not bow and apologize to her only proved that people like him did not know their place in society. However, Helen did not stop there. Her anger and racial prejudice flared up even more strongly after the small collision with David. She turned to him and loudly criticized, her words containing undisguised contempt. The words filled with racism began to flow, clearly expressing the view that she had carried with her all her life. People like David had no place in the high class and luxurious spaces that she considered the territory of white people. With a tone of contempt, Helen said that his presence here was an insult to the world that she believed should remain pure. David, who was used to such prejudices and discrimination, could not help but feel deeply offended. He had faced similar situations throughout his career and life, but Helen's public and aggressive attitude made him stop. Feelings of anger and hurt welled up inside him, but he knew he had to control himself. As a doctor, he had learned to stay calm in difficult situations, and this was one of the biggest mental challenges he had ever faced. While Helen continued to criticize, David decided not to stay silent anymore. He stood up straight, facing her calmly but firmly. His confidence and sense of entitlement were things David had fought for. He was not only a talented doctor, but also a person who knew that he had the right to exist and be respected in any space, not just because of the color of his skin, but because of who he was. His pride prompted him to speak up, not to provoke conflict, but to remind Helen that everyone has the right to live and use public spaces, regardless of skin color or background. David chose to respond in a measured way, showing firmness without losing the minimum respect for the other person. The calmness with which he responded highlighted the difference between the two. While Helen was filled with hatred and prejudice, David stood firm in his belief that everyone had the right to live, work, and enjoy the same amenities. He reminded Helen that respect was not a privilege of a certain race or social class, but a basic right of everyone, regardless of their background. However, the tension between Helen escalated. Helen, with all her deeply ingrained prejudices, could not accept the fact that society had changed and that she had no right to look down on others just because of their skin color or background. Her anger was growing, as if she was losing control of the world that was gradually moving away from the old values she had always believed in. David stood there, not saying another word. He responded calmly, but the tension in the air did not ease. Helen's words, full of hostility and contempt, stirred up a deep inner conflict within her. Her mind raced between defending her rigid views and the growing unease that her beliefs no longer matched reality. At that moment, Helen suddenly felt a sharp pain in her chest. The pain started from the middle of her chest and spread to her left arm. She felt like she couldn't breathe, as if the air around her was slowly disappearing. In an instant, the anger in her heart turned to panic. Her hands unconsciously clenched her chest. Her eyes widened as she realized what was happening to her. Helen tried to step back, but her legs seemed to no longer obey her will. She collapsed onto the hard tile floor, her body falling heavily, causing the people around her to scream in horror. The tension in the air instantly turned to fear and panic. Everyone around stopped, some shouted for help, but no one knew what to do in that urgent moment. David, standing just a few feet away from her, immediately realized Helen's dangerous condition. The chest pain, the difficulty breathing, and the way she fell to the floor were all clear signs of a stroke or acute heart attack. His medical instincts quickly took over. All the tension and hurt from Helen's harsh words were immediately pushed aside. At this moment, David was no longer an offended person, but a doctor with a duty to save people. Without hesitation, David rushed to Helen's side. He knelt down beside her, quickly checking her breathing and pulse. The people around him stood there in surprise and concern, but David did not pay attention to the crowd. He only focused on handling the emergency situation at hand. He knew that in situations like this, every second was extremely important. David acted immediately, calling the emergency number without hesitation. His voice was calm but determined as he spoke to the operator, providing all the necessary details about Helen's condition and requesting an ambulance to come immediately. After hanging up, he crouched down next to Helen, quickly starting to perform first aid. With many years of experience as a doctor, David understands that time is of the essence in this situation. He checked Helen's breathing and heartbeat and maintained a position that made it easier for her to breathe. Despite all the harsh words she had just said, David did not let his personal feelings influence his decision to save her life. This was not only a professional responsibility, but also a matter of conscience as a human being, as a doctor. While lying on the floor, Helen clearly felt the sharp pain in her chest, along with the feeling of panic as her body became useless. However, what shocked her most was the truth that was happening before her eyes. The black man she had despised and insulted was now the one trying to save her life. In that moment, Helen could not help but face the harsh truth about her behavior and perspective. Feelings of shame and guilt began to creep into her mind, at first just small specks of awareness, but gradually growing as she felt David's professionalism and dedication. His every first aid move not only saved her life, but also stood in stark contrast to what she had thought of him and others like him. It was at this moment that Helen realized that all the prejudices she had carried with her all her life were just meaningless barriers, separating her from the reality that people, regardless of skin color or background, were of equal value and dignity. Helen tried to look at David, but the pain and weakness kept her from moving. Yet her thoughts were in turmoil. The image of this man, calm and responsible, was the complete opposite of everything she had ever thought. She felt the kindness and compassion radiating from him, a kindness she had refused to acknowledge because of the color of his skin. The pain was still there, but now it was not just in her chest, but in Helen's mind. She remembered every word she had said, every contemptuous look she had given David. She had considered him inferior, someone who did not deserve to exist in the same space as her. But what was the reality? This man was putting her life above all else, doing everything to help her survive, while she had judged him with cruel thoughts. David continued his work, checking Helen's pulse and breathing, always making sure her condition did not worsen before the ambulance arrived. He noticed Helen looking at him, but didn't think much of it. To him, this woman was just a patient who needed help, and he would do whatever it took to make sure she got the best care, regardless of what had happened before. As the ambulance sirens sounded in the distance, Helen felt a sense of relief, not only because help was coming, but also because of a clearer truth: she had been wrong. Wrong in her thinking, in her judging people, and wrong in letting old prejudices guide her life. The very person she despised was the one keeping her alive. The thought weighed heavily on her heart, but it also opened a small door to change, a chance for her to realize her mistakes. When the paramedics entered, David helped them load Helen onto a stretcher and quickly informed her of her condition. It all happened in a matter of minutes, but for Helen, it was an endless moment where she had to face herself and the mistakes she had made for so long. David and the paramedics rushed her to intensive care, knowing that he had done everything he could to help her, and that was enough. Helen opened her eyes in the white hospital room. The dim light from the window next to her was blinding. The feeling of weakness and pain in her chest reminded her of the sudden heart attack at the mall. After a few seconds of confusion, her mind slowly regained the memory of the incident that had happened before. She remembered the cold and contemptuous look she had given David, the racist words that had come out of her mouth, and then the man who had rushed to save her at the moment when she thought she was about to die. Guilt welled up in her heart. All her life, Helen had lived in a world where prejudice and hatred towards people of different skin colors were the norm. She had learned from her family, from the society around her, that people of color, especially black people, could never be equal to white people. These ideas were deeply rooted in her mind, like an immutable truth. But now, lying on her hospital bed, she had to face the undeniable truth: the very person she had despised and degraded was the one who had saved her life. This realization did not come gently. It was like a storm that swept through her soul, breaking down all the barriers that had kept her trapped in a circle of discrimination and hatred. She couldn't help but recall the moment in the mall when she had despised David's presence, considered him unworthy of being in the same space as her. And then, in an instant, everything had changed. David didn't have to help her. He could have turned away, left her in her pain and fear. But he had chosen otherwise. He had saved her, despite all the insults. Helen felt deep remorse. All her life she had lived with the mistake, judging people not by their actions or qualities, but by the color of their skin. It was not only absurd, it was dangerous. She realized that it was this way of thinking that had prevented her from seeing the true value of a person. Skin color, background, none of that mattered in the face of the kindness and goodness that David had shown. As time passed, Helen slowly recovered from her heart attack. But in her mind, the storm of guilt and reflection continued. She knew that she had to face the man who had saved her, not just to thank him, but to apologize. An apology she knew would be difficult, but necessary. She had to face her actions, admit her mistakes, and find a way to make amends. The day Helen was discharged from the hospital, she felt anxious about the upcoming meeting with David. After asking the hospital staff, she learned that David was still working there, continuing the work of a doctor that he had devoted himself to for many years. Part of her was afraid, not because she was afraid that David would reject her apology, but because she knew this was a life-changing moment. Helen went to David's office at the hospital. When she entered the room, she saw him reading through a patient's file. Though she was still a little nervous, David's calm eyes and calm demeanor put her at ease. David looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no anger or resentment in his eyes, only peace and forgiveness. Helen walked slowly toward him, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But she knew she had to say what she had been holding in all this time. In a soft voice, she began, "I came here to apologize." David listened quietly, not interrupting. She continued, her voice growing firmer as she faced the truth. "I was wrong. What I said to you that day was all hateful and wrong. I judged you because of the color of your skin, and I realized how absurd and cruel that was. You saved my life, and I insulted you. You didn't have to do that. But you chose to save me. And that made me realize one thing: skin color does not determine a person's worth." David listened in silence, his face expressionless, but his eyes showing understanding. Helen felt relieved to have said all that she had kept inside. She knew that her life had changed forever from that day on. The prejudices she had believed in were now broken, replaced by the understanding that everyone deserved respect, regardless of skin color or background. David smiled gently, then spoke. He thanked Helen for having the courage to face her mistakes, and he accepted her apology. He said that what mattered most was not what had happened in the past, but the ability to change and learn from mistakes. With tolerance and kindness, David advised Helen that it was never too late to change, and that she could start by treating everyone around her with respect and kindness. Helen left the hospital that day with a completely different mood. She felt like she had just crossed a new threshold in her life. No more old prejudices, no more shallow judgments. Instead, there is a deep understanding of humanity and kindness. She knows that she cannot change the past, but she can create the future by changing herself. After this incident, Helen gradually changed her approach to the world around her. She no longer held inherent prejudices about people of color, and instead she learned to judge people by their actions and qualities. Every time she saw a person of color, instead of negative thoughts, she reminded herself of the valuable lesson she had learned from David, that a person's value is not determined by the color of their skin or where they come from, but by their kindness, understanding, and tolerance.